This is the first of a three-part series on the strategic bombing campaign against Japan during the latter part of the war in the Asia-Pacific theater. In this lecture, I will describe the Boeing B-29 Superfortress as a strategic bombing platform and its first use in Operation Matterhorn in 1943, the strategic bombing of Japan from China. Subsequent lectures on this topic will be about the strategic bombing of Japan from the Mariana Islands in 1944, and finally, the use of the B 29 to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to bring the war to an end in August 1945. The Boeing B 29 Superfortress was an American four engine, propeller driven heavy bomber and one of the most technologically advanced airplanes of the war. Its name, Superfortress, is an allusion to its predecessor, the Boeing B 17 Flying Fortress. It was designed as a high altitude strategic bomber, but also was used in low altitude incendiary bombing and in dropping naval mines to blockade Japanese ports. It also dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The $3 billion cost of design and production far exceeded the $1.9 billion cost of the Manhattan Project to build the atomic bombs, making the B 29 program the most expensive of the war. The B 29 had a wingspan of 141 feet 3 inches, a length of 99 feet, and a height of 27 feet 9 inches. The crew would enjoy, for the first time in a bomber, full pressurization comfort. This first ever cabin pressure system for an Allied production bomber was developed for the B 29. Both the forward and rear crew compartments were to be pressurized. The two crew compartments, forward and rear, were connected by a pressurized communication tunnel. The designers had to decide whether to have bomb bays that were not pressurized or a fully pressurized fuselage that would have to be depressurized prior to opening the bomb bay doors. The solution was to have bomb bays that were not pressurized and a long tunnel joining the forward and rear crew compartments. Crews could use the tunnel if necessary to crawl from one pressurized compartment to the other. This is a schematic of the B 29 showing the bomb bays relative to the forward and rear crew compartments. It also shows where the crew sat and where the defensive 50 caliber guns were located. The B 29 had an 11-man crew that consisted of the pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, flight engineer, navigator, radio operator, radar observer, tail gunner, right gunner, and left gunner. This is the crew of the Enola Gay. During the Hiroshima mission, the only defensive gun was the tail gunner. By eliminating the other guns as unnecessary, the weight was reduced. This is a performance comparison between the B-17 and the B-29. In every way measurable, the B-29 was a much better bomber. It was faster, had a longer operating range, and could carry a bigger bomb load. The Wright R-3350 Duplex Cyclone is an American twin-row, supercharged, air-cooled radial aircraft engine with 18 cylinders displacing nearly 3,350 cubic feet, 59.9 liters. Its power ranged from 2,200 to 3,700 horsepower, depending on the model. Unfortunately, it was fraught with problems, and those problems, particularly engine fires and other failures, persisted after its entry into service. In the campaign against Japan, a total of 414 B-29s were lost. 147 were downed by enemy action, while 267 were lost due to operational problems, mostly related to the engines. Edmund Turney Allen was a pioneer of modern flight tests who flew for nearly every major American aircraft manufacturer and took some of the most famous planes of all time up for their first flights. As the United States became involved in World War II, Boeing was awarded a contract to build the B-29 Superfortress. On September 21, 1942, Allen took the first XB-29 on its initial flight and continued as the program's chief test pilot. The second prototype first flew on December 30, 1942. This flight was terminated due to a serious engine fire. On February 18, 1943, the second prototype also experienced an engine fire, which was extinguished, but a second fire erupted. Two crewmen bailed out as the plane narrowly missed downtown Seattle skyscrapers on its approach to Boeing Field, but their parachutes did not deploy in time and they were killed. The plane crashed into the Fry packing plant in downtown Seattle, just short of the runway. Allen and the 8 other crewmen and 19 workers in the meat processing factory were killed. Now that we have a bomber with the requisite range and bomb load capacity to hit Japan, I want to talk a bit about the concept of strategic bombing. Before I go any further, I want to first describe the theater of interest to this topic, the China-Burma-India Theater, also known as the CBI Theater. This map depicts the theater in the Pacific during the war, known as the Pacific Theater of Operation, or PTO. This is to be distinguished from the European Theater, or ETO. During the war, the Pacific Theater was divided into 3 major sub-theaters, each under a different theater commander. The Pacific Ocean area was under the command of Admiral Chester Nimitz. The Pacific Ocean area was further subdivided into the Northern Pacific, Central Pacific, and South Pacific areas. The Southwest Pacific area was under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. This is the China-Burma-India Theater, also known as the CBI Theater. It was under the command of Lieutenant General Joe Stilwell, known behind his back as Vinegar Joe. General William Billy Mitchell is recognized as the father and patron saint of American strategic air power because he did so much to promote it, even at the cost of his career. He believed in strategic air power, the idea that air power could be used to strike at the enemy's heartland and destroy his means and willingness to wage war. That the net effect would be costly in civilian casualties he readily admitted, but in the long run it would prevent even more casualties by ending a war without the carnage of the indecisive land battles and bloodletting such as occurred in the First World War. No discussion of strategic bombing would be complete without mentioning General Hap Arnold. Although 23 years junior to Billy Mitchell, Henry Hap Arnold was a Mitchell acolyte. He received his wings in 1911 and was one of the first 24 rated military aviators authorized to wear the newly designed military aviator badge. Arnold became Army Air Force Commanding General and an ex officio member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Combined Chiefs of Staff. Because of the determination of men like Hap Arnold, the United States Army Air Corps had gotten the B-29 program started in 1940 before anything was ever proven about strategic air power with the B-17 over Europe. By 1944, when the B-29 was fully deployed, we still had yet to prove a clear-cut case for strategic air power. The post-war strategic bombing survey later showed that, in Europe, air power had been a decisive factor in achieving ultimate victory over Germany. When air power came under the command of theater commanders, as it did in Europe, the main bombing effort was in support of the infantry in ground operations. The goal of these tactical missions was to isolate the battlefield. In addition to direct support of ground operations, bombing railheads and troop lodgements further isolated the battlefield. General Hap Arnold and many in the 8th Air Force bombing Germany believed that if strategic air power were properly applied to the war-making capacity of the enemy, and if that country were deprived of the resources to wage war, it could be defeated without having to expend as many American lives as would be necessary to defeat their armies on the battlefield. In England, the 8th Air Force was under the command of General Dwight Eisenhower, who was a ground commander. The way those in the 8th Air Force saw it, Eisenhower was interested in defeating the German armies in the field, what he was trained to do. His conception of air power was using a lot of airplanes to support his ground forces. During the first 2 years of the war, command procedures for Army Air Forces in the several theaters had taken on a standardized pattern. Under prevailing doctrines of unity of command, air units were assigned to a theater commander working under broad direction from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Those units were organized into a theater air force, usually bearing a numerical designation, and divided into the conventional commands: fighter, bomber, and air service. The Pacific Ocean area was under the command of Admiral Nimitz. His air chief was Admiral John McCain. The Southwest Pacific area was under the command of General MacArthur. His air chief was General George Kenney. Though the theater commander enjoyed control of air forces, as he did also of the ground forces, in carrying out his broad mission without interference from Washington, he usually had learned to delegate to his Air Force commander a wide latitude in the choice of means by which air power might be used. This system had proved eminently satisfactory in tactical air operations. Strategic air operations seemed to pose certain special problems, and it was an attempt to solve them that the 20th Air Force was set up. By November 1943, the United States Army Air Force was organized into 15 separate air forces scattered around the world. The 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th remained within what was designated as the Zone of the Interior, today called CONUS, or Contiguous United States. By year-end 1944, there were nearly 2.4 million personnel and 80,000 planes in the Army Air Force. Yet despite being the largest air force in history, it was still part of the Army, and its numbered air forces were all under the jurisdiction of theater commanders. Hap Arnold had realized as early as the fall of 1942, when he toured the Pacific Theater, that placing the B-29 under a theater commander would be a mistake. Such a commander was concerned only with what was going on in his own theater of operations and would feel obligated to divert the B-29s to tactical targets as needed, rather than allowing them to concentrate on conducting a continuous, unrelenting strategic air offensive outside his theater against Japan, which was the B-29's ultimate purpose. Accordingly, Arnold would command the B-29s himself. A new Air Force, the 20th, would be set up directly under the Joint Chiefs of Staff, with Arnold serving as its commander as an agent of the Joint Chiefs. The new 20th Air Force was not officially constituted and activated until April 4, 1944, and General Arnold did not officially assume command until April 6th. There were two bomber commands in the 20th Air Force. The 20th Bomber Command was formed at Smoky Hill Airfield in Salina, Kansas on November 20, 1943, and was composed only of General Kenneth Wolfe's 58th Bomb Wing. The 58th Bomb Wing would be the only wing ever assigned to the 20th Bomber Command. The headquarters of the 20th Bomber Command remained at Smoky Hill Field until General Wolfe took the advance echelon to New Delhi, India in January of 1944. The 58th Bomb Wing was composed of four groups: the 40th, the 444th, the 462nd, and the 468th. The 2nd Bomber Command assigned to the 20th Air Force was the 21st, on August 28, 1944, under the command of General Hayward Hansell. After taking command of the 21st Bomber Command, General Hansell flew it out to Saipan on October 12, 1944. The United States Army Air Force began to design the operational plan for putting the B-29 into service. Two questions needed to be answered. When? The Joint Chiefs knew that because of production problems, the B-29 would not be ready until June 1944. The other question was where to base them. According to General Arnold, the Joint Chiefs did not consider Germany as a possible target for the B-29s because by the time they would be ready, the intensive bombing schedule with the B-17s and B-24s would have already destroyed most of the industrial facilities, the communication systems, and other military objectives within Germany and German-controlled Europe. He concluded that Japan would be free from aerial bombardment until he could get the B-29s ready and in place from some base that could reach Japan. In mid-May 1943, the Trident Conference was convened in Washington and attended by President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill, and their chiefs of staff. The combined chiefs of staff met in the Board of Governors room in the Federal Reserve Building. Among other topics discussed at Trident, the combined chiefs of staff took up the question of the B-29's potential role in the war against Japan. The main issue was the question of where to base the B-29s. A quick glance at the geography of the region showed that the only places then under Allied control were in China. A plan called Setting Sun was drawn up whereby the B-29s would be based near Changsha, about 1,500 miles from Tokyo, a stretch, but within the range of the B-29. It soon became clear to the planners that maintaining complete bases in central China would be virtually impossible because they would be behind enemy lines. Because the Japanese controlled all the sea and land access to the region, the only way in would be by air across the Himalayas. The B-29s could be flown into such bases, but the problem was that the bases would have to be flown in too. Setting Sun thus evolved into a plan codenamed Twilight that included, among other provisions, the idea of basing the B-29s in India that could be supplied more easily and then staging the bombing missions through advanced fields in China. At the Quadrant Conference in Quebec, Canada, Twilight was rejected, but the India-China basing idea was not. The new plan envisioned the Japanese-held Mariana Islands in the mid-Pacific as the ideal B-29 base, but recognized that by the time the B-29s were ready, the Mariana Islands would not yet be under Allied control. The India-China basing plan not only would soothe the Chinese whose foreign minister, T.V. Soong, had been at Quadrant pressing for more Allied military aid, but also would mean the B-29s would be able to hit Japan at the earliest possible moment, with or without the Marianas. Major General Kenneth Wolfe, commanding the 58th Bomb Wing of the 20th Bomber Command, pointed out certain weaknesses in the India-China plan, its logistical inefficiencies, and the vulnerability of the proposed advanced fields in China and of supply lines. Lieutenant General Vinegar Joe Stilwell insisted that 50 first-class Chinese divisions would be required to defend the airfields around Changsha, and instead recommended the advanced bases be located further back from Chinese lines at Qingtu. At the Sextant Conference in Cairo, Egypt, General Arnold endorsed the revised plan for locating the bases at Qingtu. For the first time, Chiang Kai-shek attended a wartime conference representing China. President Roosevelt liked the idea. He had made many promises to Chiang without yet being able to live up to them, but here at last was an opportunity to do something that would enlist the enthusiasm of Chiang and the nationalist Chinese forces in a war at a time when it was quite possible they might collapse. The president took up the idea with Chiang and Churchill and sold it over the objections of the American Joint Chiefs, the Joint Logistics Committee, and the Joint Plans Committee. It was a military-political plan at the most, but its objectives were political: to placate Chiang Kai-shek and to keep China in the war, to initiate B-29 operations against the Japanese home islands, and to avoid committing the B-29 to areas for tactical use from which they might not be redirected to the strategic air offensive against Japan. At Sextant, General Haywood Possum Hansel persuaded the Joint Chiefs of Staff to direct the Navy-dominated Pacific Ocean Area Command to seize the Marianas as bases for the B-29s. The Marianas were within range of the Japanese home islands and could be supplied by sea much more easily than the advanced bases in China could be supplied by airlift across the treacherous Himalayas. These are the cities within the range of the B-29s from the Marianas. Within this range were all the major Japanese industrial cities, including Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. Until the Marianas were taken, the only place the B-29s could reach Japan was from China. Over the objections of his advisors, President Roosevelt approved the India-China B-29 basing plan on November 10, 1943. The new plan was called Matterhorn. These are the minutes from the Sextant Conference. Originally classified, the conference materials were not declassified until October 3, 1973, and made available to the general public. In the section under the title Specific Operations for the Defeat of Japan, 1944, on page 67, it reads, "It shall include also the establishing without materially affecting other approved operations of a very long-range strategic bombing force at Calcutta with advanced bases at Chengdu to attack vital targets in the Japanese inner zone." The inner zone included Japan proper, Manchuria, North China, Karafuto or Japanese Sakhalin, and Formosa. I want to now spend a few minutes talking about Operation Matterhorn, and no, we did not bomb Switzerland during the war. Matterhorn began with the construction phase. In the case of India, it would be most profitable to bring existing airfields and those currently being built up to B-29 specifications. Because of the good port facilities, Calcutta was chosen as the base area. The planners settled on the airfields located on the flatlands west of Calcutta at Kharagpur. These existing airfields had 6,000-foot-long concrete runways that could be lengthened to handle B-29s, which required runways of 8,500 feet and capable of supporting 70 tons. When construction lagged, the airfields at Kara were temporarily used for Matterhorn by extending its 6,000-foot runway with 900-foot mats. When Brigadier General Wolfe arrived in India in January 1944, he found only Indian workers on the job, both men and women, attempting to move 1.7 million cubic yards of earth in wicker baskets balanced on their shoulders. Desperate to speed up construction, General Wolfe persuaded a reluctant General Stilwell, commander of the CBI theater, to divert 2 engineering battalions from other CBI projects to aid in the preliminary work. By the end of April 1944, there were 6,000 American troops working on the airfields assisted by 27,000 local workers. The Indians did the jobs that could be accomplished by hand, while the Americans did those requiring skilled labor and heavy equipment. Large quantities of cement had to be imported from the United States. The concrete was produced with the equipment on hand and laid and spread by Indian workers using hand tools. Because of the lack of more heavy equipment and skilled labor, construction lagged behind schedule, but by June 1944, 4 airfields were ready, although all were not completed until September. The forward bases for Matterhorn were placed near Chengdu, China in Sichuan province. Under an agreement negotiated by President Roosevelt and Chiang Kai-shek, the United States was to provide the planning, overall supervision, and funding for the airfields, while the Chinese would supply the labor and materials and direct the construction forces. Because it was impractical to fly heavy equipment over the hump, almost all of the work had to be done by hands as depicted in these 2 photos. Here are the locations of the airfields in the Chengdu area. From the forward bases at Chengdu, the B-29s could only hit the most southern part of Japan on the island of Kyushu. These are the routes the B-29s flew from Calcutta over the hump to get to the advanced bases at Chengdu. The overseas movement of the B-29s was to begin on March 10, 1944. The plan called for 150 B-29s of the 58th Bomb Wing to leave the United States in daily increments of 9 or 10 planes. The 5-day trip, covering 11,500 miles, was scheduled by way of Salina, Kansas, to Gander Lake, Newfoundland, to Marrakesh, Morocco, to Cairo, Egypt, to Karachi, and to Calcutta, India. If everything went well, all the bombers would be at their bases in India by March 31st. This schedule would prove to be overly optimistic. On March 26, the first contingent of B-29s left Salina. It reached India on April 2nd. Others soon followed, and by April 15th, a total of 32 B-29s had arrived at their bases. A week later, the loss of several planes to accidents along the way prompted the Army Air Force to ground all B-29s that were en route until the accidents could be investigated. Most of the accidents occurred due to engine failure. After the problem was addressed by Boeing engineers, the flights resumed on April 29th and thereafter proceeded more rapidly. Through the rest of 1944 and early 1945, 255 additional B-29 were dispatched to India, so that by the end of March 1945, when Matterhorn was closed down, 405 B-29s had been committed to the operation. The defense of the airfields in India was a minor concern. They were situated at the extreme range of Japanese bombers, and the U.S. 10th Air Force and the Royal Air Force had sufficient fighter strength to provide adequate protection. The Qingtu airfields in China were more vulnerable to Japanese air attack, and the Matterhorn plan called for 150 fighters to be assigned to their defense. No logistical aspect of Matterhorn was more exasperating than the transport of gasoline and supplies from India to Qingtu. Everything that was sent to China had to be flown over the hump. Matterhorn had been planned to be self-supporting. The 20th Bomber Command would carry all of its own cargo to China. For this purpose, 20 of the precious B-29s were stripped of their armament except for the tail guns and converted into tankers to fly in the dearly needed fuel. The remaining B-29s were used to haul other supplies. To get over the hump, the planes had to climb to an altitude of 25,000 feet, the highest air transport route in the world, and then contend with the fierce weather conditions of the Himalayan mountains, including sub-zero temperatures that would often ice their wings, violent updrafts and downdrafts that could cause sudden loss of control, snowstorms, and dense cloud formations. The hump flights exacted a heavy toll in crashed planes and crew killed. During the early months of 1944, the 20th Bomber Command lost 12 B-29s and 6 C-46s. The transport of fuel and supplies to Qingtu was a costly and time-consuming operation. Depending on the weather, at its worst, the B-29s burned 12 gallons of gasoline to transport 1 gallon to Qingtu. It took 7 trips back and forth across the hump for the B-29 to move enough fuel to the Chinese staging bases for a B-29 to participate in one bombing mission against Japan. Before attempting a raid on Japan, General Wolfe, commanding officer of the 20th Bomber Command, decided to conduct a shakedown combat mission. The chosen target was the Makassan Railway Yard facilities in Bangkok, Thailand. Even though this was a practice run, it was a legitimate military target. A successful attack could affect the supply of Japanese troops fighting around Impal. The decisive factor in the choice of target was that it could be attacked from the airfields near Calcutta and would not affect the supply stockpiled in Qingtu. Of the 112 bombers that were readied for the mission, 98 took off from India. Most of the bombers that failed to take off had engine problems. One plane crashed shortly after takeoff when an engine lost power, killing all aboard except the co-pilot. 13 planes aborted en route and turned back. 77 planes found the target. 7 planes reached Bangkok but were unable to bomb due to mechanical problems. 6 had problems with their bomb bays. Because the target was obscured by clouds, 48 planes bombed by radar, although most crews had not been instructed in this technique. This photo depicts one of the B-29s that took part in the Bangkok raid. It was B-29 42-6310, later named the Happy Hump Jr. of the 40th Bombardment Group. 4 planes were lost on the return trip. 2 ditched into the Bay of Bengal after fuel ran out due to problems with the fuel transfer system. 1 crashed attempting to land at another airfield, and 1 diverted to Kunming, China, but ran out of fuel and the crew had to bail out. The mission to Bangkok resulted in the loss of 5 B-29s and the deaths of 15 aircrew, with 2 more missing. Photo reconnaissance on June 8th indicated that 16 or 18 bombs had fallen within the target area. There was some damage to rolling stock and buildings, including the erecting and boiler shops. It was assessed that the damage would have no impact on the Japanese forces in Burma. Still, the 20th Bomber Command rated the mission as a success. The following day, Wolfe received orders from Arnold for an attack on Japan with at least 70 B-29s on June 15th. Arnold wanted to impress Japan with the power of the B-29, but also to assist the 14th Air Force in East China. The raid was also to coincide with the invasion of Saipan to divert attention away from the Marianas. Wolfe calculated that he would have enough fuel for a raid, but not enough for all the B-29s to return to India immediately afterwards. A particular problem was that only 86 B-29s could be equipped with the Bombay gas tanks needed for the flight to Japan. The B-29s began staging to China on June 13th. Each carried a full bomb load of 8 500-pound, 230-kilogram general-purpose bomb, so only refueling was required in China. Of the 92 B-29s that departed, 79 made it to Qingtu and 1 crashed en route. The target chosen for the mission was the Imperial Iron and Steel Works in Yawata on the northern tip of Kyushu. The raid on Yawata was the first on the Japanese home island since the Doolittle raid in April 1942 and marked the beginning of the strategic bombing campaign against Japan. Only 47 of the 68 B-29s launched hit the target area. 1 crashed en route, 6 jettisoned their bombs because of mechanical difficulties, and 7 bombed secondary targets or targets of opportunity. 6 bombers suffered minor damage from flak, and 1 was lost over Yawata, which was shot down by a Japanese fighter. On the way back to Qingtu, 2 B-29s crashed into mountainsides in China with the loss of all aboard, and 1 had to make an emergency landing and was then destroyed when a Japanese fighter strafed it. Throughout Matterhorn, the bombing results were disappointing and logistical problems continued to plague the mission. In July 1944, General Arnold sacked General Wolfe and replaced him with General Curtis LeMay, who at 37 years of age was the youngest 2-star general in the U.S. Army. Curtis Emerson LeMay was born in Columbus, Ohio in 1906 and received a degree in civil engineering from Ohio State University in 1927. He received his commission in the United States Army 2 years later and steadily rose through the ranks until by October 1943 he was promoted to brigadier general. He commanded the 305th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force from October 1942 until September 1943, and then the 3rd Air Division in the European Theater until August 1944, when he was ordered to take command of the 20th Air Force in India as part of Operation Matterhorn. The combat box was a tactical formation used by strategic bombers during World War II and honed by General LeMay while in Germany. The combat box was also referred to as a staggered formation. Its defensive purpose was in massing the firepower of the bombers' guns, while offensively it concentrated the release of bombs on a target. Initially, formations were created in keeping with the pre-war Air Corps doctrine that massed bombers could attack and destroy targets in daylight without fighter escort, relying on interlocking fire from their defensive machine guns, almost exclusively the M2 Browning 50 caliber gun. However, the use of high altitudes by the United States Army Air Force bombers resulted in factors that demanded a tighter bomb pattern, and the combat box continued in use even after the advent of fighter escort largely mitigated the threat of fighter interception. This is the location within the box of the lead element of bombers. This is the location of the high element above and to the left of the lead element. This is the location of the low element below and to the right of the lead element. This is the location of the low element below and behind the lead element. Colonel LeMay personally led several dangerous missions, including the Regensburg section of the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission on August 17, 1943. In that mission, he led 146 B-17s to Regensburg, Germany, beyond the range of fighter escorts, and, after bombing, continued to bases in North Africa. Among his men, he was known as a commander who led from the front and willing to share the dangers of a mission with them. General LeMay's first stop on his way to the China-Burma-India theater was to visit General Arnold in Washington to discuss his new mission in China and the use of the B-29 and its myriad problems. During that conference, General Arnold presented LeMay with the Distinguished Flying Cross. If he was going to command B-29s, he said to General Arnold, "If I'm going to command a bunch of airplanes that are strange to me, I'm going to learn to fly one of them first." General Arnold was not keen on the idea, but eventually relented and agreed to set up a special course for him at a B-29 school near Grand Island, Nebraska. After a month of learning to fly the B-29 and gaining an understanding of its problems, he decided it was time to hurry over to India. LeMay intended to fly a B-29 to India, but nobody knew when it would be ready. Instead, he flew a much more reliable Douglas C-54, arriving in India on August 29th to take over the fledgling 20th Bomber Command. During his tenure in the ETO, there were no rules about commanders flying combat missions. Every commander flew them when and as often as he considered it necessary. LeMay flew the first 5 missions of the 305th Bomb Group. Very soon, someone at headquarters discovered that the RAF had lost over half of its experienced commanders in the first few months of the war. To prevent this from happening to the United States Army Air Force as well, an order was issued forbidding commanders to fly in combat. When LeMay was sent to India to take over the 20th Air Force, General Arnold expressly forbid him from flying any more missions. LeMay prevailed upon Arnold to let him fly one more mission, but before he could fly that mission, he was briefed on the atomic bomb, which precluded him ever flying a combat mission for the remainder of the war. Someone with atomic bomb knowledge could not be allowed to fall into Japanese hands. Eventually, General Stilwell was replaced by General Wiedemeyer. Both he and General Chennault pushed General LeMay to bomb the Japanese gathering at Hankow for a drive against the Chinese nationalists at Chongqing. At first, General LeMay refused as it wasn't in line with his orders as part of the strategic bombing campaign to bomb Japan. General LeMay finally did get the orders directly from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to bomb Hankow. General LeMay hit Hankow on December 18, 1943, with 84 B-29s. This was a tactical use of the B-29. It was the first large-scale attack on Japanese position using incendiaries, and its success gave him a great deal of useful information about the effects of incendiaries on the highly inflammable wood and paper construction common to the housing stock in the Far East. Despite the modest successes and the lessons learned from the Hankow raid, the B-29s of the 20th Air Force did not accomplish as much from China as hoped. General LeMay recommended to General Arnold to not send any more B-29s to India after November 1943 because bases in China could not be adequately supplied. As soon as the Marines captured and occupied the Marianas, the 20th Air Force operations in India and China were closed down and moved to Guam. I will continue this lecture series on the strategic bombing of Japan in Part 2, the non-nuclear bombing of Japan, including the firebombing missions of Japanese cities.